Welcome. Good morning and good afternoon and good morning if you're joining us from out west. Welcome to the second webinar in the 2024-2025 FCM Collective Series. Today's session is entitled Trials from the Trails, helping build resiliency and supporting mental health and well-being for elected officials and those who work with them. My name is Evan Clark, and I'm the Manager of Partnerships and Sponsorships at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I'm so glad to welcome our presenting partners, GreenShield Canada, today for a discussion on the mental health impacts of public life, campaigning, working on council, and at City Hall. It's unfortunate that this is a topic of such relevance today, but our hope is that today's session might equip our members with some tools to manage the influence outside forces are able to exert on their lives and those of their colleagues and staff. As we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, I want to acknowledge that FCM's head office is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. As an organization, FCM endeavors to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, grow in knowledge, and adapt our ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples and honor their leadership and partnership in sharing and strengthening communities across the country. I welcome you all to acknowledge the land you are joining us from. Now, before I turn things over to the experts, I have just a few housekeeping items to mention. L'interprétation simultanée est disponible pour notre session aujourd'hui. Pour accéder à l'audio en français, il faut simplement cliquer la petite icône du globe au bas de l'écran vers la droite et sélectionner le français. If you do not select a language, you will hear the live audio today in English. Je vous donne quelques secondes pour faire le choix de langue. If you would like to ask a question today, please pose your questions in the chat, and if time allows, I'll help facilitate a brief Q&A at the end of our session. Finally, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on demand on the FCM website. I would now like to introduce you to our moderator for today's session. Harriet Ekperigan is the Vice President of People Success and Transformation at GreenShield Canada, where she leads efforts to enhance the employee experience. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Harriet was instrumental in expanding Ontario's virtual mental health services, transforming a pilot into a province-wide program that supported over 120,000 people. Starting her career as a mental health nurse in the UK, she later joined the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada, where she reduced wait times by 40% in the mood and anxiety program. A passionate advocate for virtual care, Harriet values partnerships that deliver accessible, evidence-based health services. She currently chairs the board of directors for Connex Ontario. Over to you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Evan, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guests today. We have Sarah Good, who is a dedicated city councillor in Cornwall. Sarah was elected in 2022, and she is passionate about creating a more sustainable and connected community by advocating for environmental initiatives and community services that strengthen well-being and resilience. As a mom and stepmom to 2 young children, Sarah understands the importance of fostering supportive networks and access to resources that helps families thrive. Sarah also balances her councillor role with her work in engagement and population health for her local Ontario health team. Our second guest is Marion Lowen, who was first elected to council in 2011 and was re-elected in 2012, 2016, and 2020. Marion has a BA in Political Science from Carleton University and an MA in Political Studies from the University of Saskatchewan. She's a co-founder and active volunteer with Girls Rock Saskatoon and has also volunteered with CFCR Community Radio, Open Doors Society, and the Heart of the City Piano Program. And last but not least, we have Andrew LeBlanc, who is the mayor for the town of Riverdale. He was first elected as councillor at large in 2012 and again in 2016, and elected as mayor in 2021. Mayor Andrew is employed as the executive director for Atlantic Wellness, a non-profit organization that provides free mental health services for youth ages 12 to 21. Andrew has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 2 decades, supporting youth and children. Thank you, all three of you, for joining me today. What I hope will be a provocative yet practical conversation. My hope today is that we will leave the audience with some thoughtful and useful takeaways. I'm very excited about this session, actually, because each of you are in very different stages of your municipal/political careers. Marion, you being the veteran on this panel, and you're on your way out, so congratulations. Sarah, you being the newbie, being 2 years in, I'm sure that there'll be lots for you to learn from Marion. And Andrew is sandwiched between both of you with over 14 years in this game. So let's start by going to Andrew, actually. Andrew, being the city councillor, as I was reading your bio, it became very clear to me that you wear many different hats. And we can all say that we all wear many different hats, but looking at your bio, between city mayor, executive director for Atlantic Wellness, and when we chatted earlier in the week or last week, you talked about being a father and a husband. I was reading your bio and listening to you, and I was feeling overwhelmed. Where do you find the time to do all of these things? I imagine that you feel tired all the time. So how do you balance all of these responsibilities? Surely they're not all part-time and they all need 100% of your time. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Thank you, Harriet. And thank you, FCM and GreenShield, for putting this on today. Yes, I am tired all the time, and that is how I live my life. And I think there's a lot of factors that go into being able to balance all of these things. You know, when I first decided to run for mayor, I was the first person I talked to was my wife, and she gave me the green light. And the deal was I was allowed to run for mayor as long as I didn't make her go to all the events with me. So, so we were able to do that. But, you know, I had a great conversation with the board of directors at Atlantic Wellness. We have a pretty big mandate as an organization to provide mental health services to young people in our community. And so that takes a lot of time as well. And so I couldn't do this without the support of my family and without the support of my employer as well. And I recognize that that's not necessarily a position that everybody is in to be able to do this work all the time. But I think there's a couple of key things. One is being able to set boundaries really effectively and being able to set priorities. Personally, for me, family always comes first. So whether it's Atlantic Wellness or whether it's council related work, if there's something that requires my attention from a family perspective, that will always be the priority for me. But I think it's your values and I think it's your priorities as an individual that can help make you successful in an elected life, because people are really looking for, you know, the type of personality and character you bring to this position. And so I think if you can demonstrate that in how you balance life, how you make decisions, people are really drawn to that. And so, you know, I'm a resident of Riverview as well. And I think people are looking for folks who are really connected to what they're doing. And I think the balance and the work that I've done to try and allow myself to be a part of all these different things has played in my favor so far anyway.
It sounds like you have a pretty good handle on how to balance things and how to manage your time, which is, I'm hoping that for the folks listening, that they're taking away some of those nuggets. So thanks for sharing that with us. Marin, congratulations on your upcoming retirement from your current role. You lasted 13 years. I'm sure that during that time you saw a lot of changes. We won't talk about how you managed your time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm curious about the tangible changes that you made during your time as councillor, and your ability to reflect on those changes and when they happened and things that you did to kind of make those changes, and how you hold yourself accountable to those changes when it comes to mental health and well-being.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think when I think back about the arc of my time on council, which is just about at its conclusion, I feel like the pandemic was a bit of a turning point for both how we thought about the mental health of council members, but also the mental health of people working in the local government space. And so we did make some changes around that time. I think there were a number of variables that sort of brought that to the fore. One of which obviously being like the pressures of the pandemic itself, but also some of the peripheral effects of the period, including increased political polarization, really difficult rhetoric, challenging and antisocial behavior in the community. And so we made a couple changes that I think were important. One was to add some capacity to the city itself in terms of providing mental health supports for staff. Of course, you know, as a unionized workplace, they have already negotiated a number of benefits, but there was a clear need to provide some more mental health support to city workers. And so that was something that council was able to support in the last 4 years. And concurrently, we realized that the supports that we had for ourselves were really poor. I don't know if other panelists are sort of having a parallel experience, but we realized that we hadn't made the same provisions for council members and the mayor as we had for employees of the city. So we developed our own EFAP program and increased the access to counseling both for ourselves and for family. And I think when I think back about, you know, what are some of the most tangible changes, I think those are top of mind. The only other thing I wanted to mention is it's not directly about mental health, but I think it is directly linked to people's well-being in the workplace. And that's in 2020, our council undertook a process to try to identify and tackle barriers, systemic barriers and systemic racism within our corporation, within the city of Saskatoon, to try to improve really to identify first what those barriers were and to ask employees of the corporation how we could make the corporation a better place to work and to remove those sorts of systemic barriers for people's careers and their experiences within the corporation. And so trying to tackle that systemic racism and those discriminatory barriers within the workplace is another thing that I think of when I think about how our council has worked to improve mental health and well-being for the employees of the city of Saskatoon.
That sounds like you made quite a number of changes, which you sound like you're quite proud of. Do you have any regrets about pursuing your position as councillor?
No, I don't. I really enjoyed being on city council. It's no longer a good fit for me and my family. We're just sort of in that era where it's more and more difficult for me to be out of the house. But I think one thing that is really worth noting is that everyone's experience is so different. And even within my council, my colleagues have very different experiences. You know, I have represented a ward which is quite affluent. It is sort of post-war suburbs. The kinds of issues that I have to deal with day to day are just not the same as the neighborhood issues for my colleagues who represent underserved areas with higher rates of poverty, homelessness, addiction, mental health crises, social disorder. This is just so there's just so many different experiences of being on council. I know some of my colleagues have experienced a lot of racism in their role as councillors. I think of one colleague who is an Indigenous colleague who represented an area where we were making a street name change. We were changing the name of the road, Johnny McDonald Road. And, you know, the amount of abuse that he personally had to withstand was just really horrifying. So I don't regret running for council. I've had a good experience running for council, but a lot of the things that have supported my positive experience on council are circumstantial and in some cases related to my privilege. And so I don't think it's reasonable to extrapolate from my experience that everyone would have that type of positive experience. So, and certainly that gets to, I think, some of the things we're talking about today, but I've had a wonderful time on council. I know that not everyone has that experience.
Right. So what you're saying is that it might not be for everyone, and you have to kind of build a lot of resilience, especially when you're dealing in when you're councillor in those areas that are a little bit more difficult to move the dial and to make those changes.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, you know, certainly developing a personal resilience and ensuring you have balance and support in your role is one factor. And then another factor is, you know, what are the more sort of structural changes we can make to support councillors who are dealing with burnout, being targeted by their constituents, managing really high stakes political issues. So I think it's a little bit on the personal side and also on the sort of structural side.
Thank you for that. As you were speaking, I was hoping that Sarah either had her hands on her ears, not listening, being the new one, we don't want to scare her off. But Sarah, you've been at this for 2 years now, and I think that as with many folks who go into something new, we're often filled with hopes and enthusiasm until we get started, and then we kind of start to peel back the layers of the onion and see that it's not all rosy. If you could share with us, what has been your biggest disappointment? And how quickly have you built the resilience, and how have you quickly built the resilience to continue on this journey, having been 2 years in?
Thanks, Harriet. And I didn't cover my ears. I'm sorry about that. But, you know, definitely getting into this position, and I think for anyone who is new into politics, you want to solve all the problems, right? And we hear from the community, and I'm part of my community too. I've worked in the nonprofit sector in particular, and in social services and health. And so we see some of the shortcomings in the community quite evidently. And I think, you know, not my biggest disappointment, certainly, but I think one of the challenges that I have come to accept is the pace of government and the pace of change, which I had this expectation that, you know, if you're really concise and you've got really well thought out ideas, that it would be so easy to just roll out these changes. And I think what I've come to realize is, one, things take time. Two, there's a lot of moving parts, you know, not just among the different departments who need to kind of collaborate together on actually implementing changes, but I might have an idea that I think is awesome. And if I haven't had a chance to kind of talk to some of my colleagues and suss out that idea, some of my very first motions did not go nearly as well as I thought they would, because I hadn't had a chance to actually build that relationship with my colleagues. But you know, it's interesting, like, I think my biggest disappointment that I didn't expect was around how it changed some of my relationships, my pre-existing relationships. I was really, really fortunate that during my campaign, I had a great deal of support from my friends and community members. And I had been, you know, warned, like, you better build a thick skin, because I'm a pretty sensitive, emotional person. And I like totally rejected that. And like, you know, this is who I am authentically. And I really think that if I'm just going to try and be, you know, numb to maybe some of the vitriol, which I think, you know, is obviously evident online, that that's not who I am. I don't want to be that. But what I found really challenging was the people, or a handful of people who I felt like I had, you know, built a good relationship with, especially over the campaign. Some of those relationships changed. It felt like almost instantaneously when
Wow.
I was elected. So, um, that hit me harder than anything that I could have imagined. Because, you know, you expect that there are going to be people who are dissatisfied, and that, you know, they're going to be unhappy almost no matter what. And so it's kind of easy to, I don't want to say dismiss that, because I try to be very intentional and open and really listen to what people have to say. But when you have someone who's close to you who feels like they're circumventing you in your role and doing things to make your job more difficult, it's like, hey, just give me a call on the phone. Like, we can
Yeah.
talk through this, and I really want to help and support the community. And I'm not here to block anybody from doing things. I want to help make positive change in the community. So I think that was challenging. And like I mentioned, building relationships with my colleagues, given that I was one of two new people on, actually, sorry, three new people on our council of 11, almost everyone there had a pre-existing relationship. So I had a relationship with a couple of people. And I think going in, I thought, oh, we're going to have this, you know, I'll have support at the very least from my female counselors. Um, you know, that girl power. And that didn't always play out the way that I
Right.
thought it would. So,
Right.
yeah, it's multifaceted for sure. It's hard to
Yeah.
put a pin on what was the biggest disappointment. There's a lot of positive, but there's obviously, you know, big challenges that come with people.
In terms of building a thick skin, you talked about, you know, people warned you to build a thick skin. Do you think that's something that you've managed to work on, or you're working towards it, or you now have a thick skin?
No, I don't think I now have a thick skin at all. I think I still am a very sensitive person. And honestly, I've cried at the council table, and not necessarily because of what people are saying to me, but just because some of the issues that we're dealing with are really highly sensitive. And I, you know, talking about people's lives and the scale, and some of them are really positive, but no, I don't think I've built a thick skin. I think what I've tried to do is that when there's people who are naysayers or who are angry about something, I think that emotion it comes from somewhere that's really valid. So I kind of try and dissect that, especially if it's someone who I don't have a pre-existing relationship with, to say, like, I want to hear where this perspective is coming from, because I think the
Right.
feeling is right, but sometimes the facts are wrong.
Thanks. I would love for you and Marion to connect after this, because I think she could probably, I'm imagining, Marion, that you had similar experiences when you started your career in this path, and I think it would be helpful to get some learnings, because that's what this is about as well, right? Not just about the audience, but about each other and supporting each other.
Absolutely. And I know when we met last week, Marin had talked about, whenever she had her child, and was already on council, and I had my child like a year and a half before I started my role on council. So when I was elected, I both went back to work from my maternity leave and started council. So it was like a huge juggling act. And I know, Andrew, you're in the same kind of position as well, where there's a lot of balls in the air, and you kind of got to do your best to prioritize which ones you don't want to drop, because we can't do everything, right?
Definitely. I think I'm interested to know if any of you had any resources that was offered to you when you decided to run, and yes or no, and how about after you were elected? And any one of you can take that.
Are you like specific to mental health and well-being?
Yeah, specific to mental health and well-being.
No, not for me. I think after a time, and I sort of began to talk more openly with other councillors, it became clear that a lot of people were like, the key to my success is having periodically seeing a counselor, having good work-life balance. And it took me a while to sort of get into that groove. My life changed to the positive when in the 2016 election, because there were 3 councillors elected in that election who became really close friends. And that experience was new to me at that point on council. And so some of what Sarah is talking about, like hoping to find that collegiality, and particularly with other women on council, it did happen for me, but it didn't happen right away. So that was huge. And having a chance to be, really vulnerable with colleagues and trusting each other enough to share what we were going through is something that has been available in the last 8 years on our council. I think, there's lots of reasons for that, but our mayor has set a very positive tone. And I think to Sarah's earlier point about crying, I don't really think that's always a bad thing. Like, I think it's important to sort of experience the emotional side of the job, and to pretend that isn't a factor, I think is not believable, or it's not worth pretending. So so I think that's a positive thing. But no, I didn't really have anything offered to me. I was fortunate to have those opportunities and that wisdom kind of come my way over time, but it was definitely not in the early years on council. It was not something that was being talked about. And so I'm fortunate that we did get there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You're talking about crying not being a bad thing. It's about being vulnerable, right? And vulnerability is not a bad thing. I often refer to vulnerability as a superpower if used in the right way. So I think that's just kind of reinforcing that cry when you need to cry. If it makes changes, that's okay. Andrew, coming to you, you spoke about your balance with varying roles and responsibilities, and prioritizing family first and setting boundaries. But I'm sure that somewhere along the way, there must have been a situation where you failed to prioritize your well-being. Can you tell us if can you describe a situation to us? What did you learn from that experience, and how did you change your approach?
For the record, I've also teared up in a council meeting, so
Good.
yeah, certainly. I think the balancing act is always a challenge, and so there's definitely been times when I've struggled with it. I think the best example of that is over the last year. We've had some not personal health issues, but within the family, and I've had to pick up a lot more at home to help cover off some of the health issues that we've been experiencing. And so it added a lot of stress, added a lot of pressure. And so that was really, really difficult to navigate, you know, 2 jobs, family life, and the added health pressures of whatever was going on on the personal side of things. And so I think in moments like that, the best way, or probably the best thing I learned from that situation was the importance of having a really good support network, the importance of having a self-care plan. I've also really focused on being more active and exercising and eating healthier over the last couple of years of my term on council, but in particular over the last 12 months, because it's been a really good way for me to implement some coping strategies and dealing with the additional anxiety and stress that have gone with that. And I'll be honest, that's still something that I'm working on now, trying to make sure that, you know, I'm getting enough sleep at night and really able to turn things off. One of the resources that I've put in place for myself, I have a psychologist that I talk to pretty frequently, and that's my outlet to be able to work on my own mental health plan and my self-care plan, because then I can really start to, one, make sure I'm living to my values. I think when you start to stray from values-based decision making and priorities, I think that's when we expose ourselves to compassion fatigue, and we can start to really feel that burnout. And that's where I was. So being able to implement the self-care plan and really, you know, stay on top of priorities and things like that really helped me navigate through that really challenging situation. And, you know, things like that are always going to happen. And so making sure that we have the coping strategies as elected officials to be able to get ourselves through that makes it a lot easier to navigate through those situations. I think otherwise we get lost in the weeds on, you know, negative social media comments, and it's really easy for us to spend an entire day just going through all the comments and tags that people are making on social media. But when you've got your priorities and your values straight, it's a lot easier to just stay focused on what it is you want to focus on, and kind of block out all the noise and stick to your self-care plan.
Thank you for those really practical tips. So mental health and self-care plan, exercise, eating healthily, sleeping at night, value-based decision making. I think those are all really practical things. And sometimes when people talk about, you know, exercising and sleeping, it seems as though, okay, here we go again. It's just the normal, it's the norm. But I think for somebody like you who's balancing all of these responsibilities and roles, it's really important that we hear from people like you that these practical things actually work to help you to continue to do the work that you do at the capacity that you need to do them. So thank you for reinforcing that. In terms of like social media and the vitriol, Sarah, you talked about that a little bit. And your bio states that you're passionate about creating a more sustainable and connected community by advocating for environmental initiatives and community services that strengthen well-being and resilience. We often feel that the municipal and political career is a thankless job. Do you feel that the community that you're striving to build these initiatives for, do you feel that they appreciate your passion, and do they understand the mental health issues that's faced by elected officials?
Okay, loaded question. Do they appreciate the mental health strain that is experienced by elected officials? I'd say by and large, no. I think there's like a little bit of dehumanization that often happens for elected officials at any level. And I think the higher up you go, the truer that is. Luckily, in municipal politics, we're the closest to the people, we're the closest to our community. So, you know, I would say that the contrast between the online stuff and the in-person is absolutely night and day. And it almost doesn't even matter where I end up when I see people in person. And, sometimes it'll take them a second. They're, oh my gosh, hey, yeah, you're Sarah Good. You're one of our, I voted for you. And they're like, oh, you're doing such a good job. And when you hear somebody say that to you who you do not know, it feels really, really good to be seen. And I'm always impressed and surprised at how many people actually tune into our meetings and pay attention to what's happening around the council table. So again, I think in person, by and large, that's been my experience, is this like genuine appreciation. And I think that it's just the nature of, I think, the anonymity that comes from online engagement, that people can get very negative online, and then you get into the back and forth where other people are kind of defending you. But I think kind of Andrew alluded to it before, how much time you can spend it's like almost in this false community that really isn't representative necessarily of the people that you serve. And so I've had to be very, I've chosen to be very selective about how much time I'm spending actually reading these kinds of comments online. There's, on one hand, you want to be aware of what people are saying, but on the other hand, it can very quickly dissolve into something that's just not constructive or productive. And so I know that I need to protect my time and I need to protect my mental health. So I do try to be really careful about that, and I'll try and get in front of issues. Like I'll say in particular, our community is, we're going to be implementing organics collection and at the same time clear plastic bags for our waste. And God, I can't tell you how upset people are about clear plastic bags. But I'm very supportive of it, in part because it's evidence-based, it's well researched, and the report that came back to us was like, hey, this is the reason why we're going to be doing this, and it's extending our landfill, it's ensuring that we're having diversion. And so is it like the biggest priority for every single person? No, but I think what I can do is kind of get out ahead of that and say, hey, this is happening, here's why it's happening, here's why I support it, instead of allowing people to have that opportunity to speculate and create that narrative for me and for council.
Yeah, I think, but people will though, right? They will still do that. And Marion, I'm sure that through your years on council, you experienced some of that speculation and hatred and vitriol. And if not you, your colleagues, I'd like to turn the attention to how you have supported your colleagues, especially those that you spoke to earlier around, facing criticisms or racism, and who have it tougher than you have had. Some of the things that you have done to support those colleagues. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, well, I cannot take credit for this, but so we began, we had a term that started in 2016, and my son was born in 2017, and that was like a bit of a test drive for our council, although I wasn't the first person to give birth while in office. My colleagues were, my colleague in a previous council had 2 children in office, and in any case, we started to realize we needed to develop more infrastructure around how to support one another in life circumstances where we needed support. So what ended up happening was that my colleagues really advocated for the development of a leave policy, or for some policies and procedures around what would need to happen when one of us, for whatever reason, needed to take a step back. And this approach has now been utilized a number of times for, stress related reasons, needing to take a step back, for parental leave, for family leave. And so having that formalized policy, what it did was provide instructions that any member of council could access really for any reason. And then once that process was initiated, the clerk's office would help to coordinate coverage for that person for the duration of their absence. And lots of people have used it for lots of different reasons, and it's been very effective. And ultimately, it just ensures some continuity for residents to be able to have support from council when their particular counselor needs to step back. But it's interesting because it has been so well used since it's been developed. And when I think back to how many people could have, including me, could have benefited from something like that, to me, that stands out as one of the most tangible examples of how we have sort of supported one another on this council, and tried to make space for, trying to, as Andrew mentioned, like trying to make interventions before you arrive at a stage of burnout. And so, when one of us has a really tricky constituency issue, we have shared sometimes the responsibility for responding to residents or doing communications around those issues. Now, it does to some degree rely on cooperation and trust between council colleagues, and that's not always possible. But it has worked well, and so I hope that continues in the future with this new council that's just being sworn in.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that for those folks in the audience that are interested in something like that, I'm sure they'll be able to hopefully reach out to get some tips from you. And speaking of audience, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be coming to audience questions shortly. But before we do, just want to go back to Andrew for a moment, and then we'll go back to Marion. I'm talking. You mentioned something about you've cried on council, and it strikes me today also that today is International Men's Day. And I'm sure for folks in the audience, I heard that, you sharing that I've cried on council is like, oh, I wonder how that went. Curious, because, being a woman, it's often like, oh, women cry, men don't, and men don't show vulnerability. Can you just share with us what the response of you crying on council was, and how you felt after that event?
I mean, I think it largely went unnoticed, probably. I think in my specific instance, we do community presentations, and so we're hearing from a local group who's doing some really good work, and some of those stories are really, really touching. More broadly, I think the emotional connection to the work that we do allows us to approach it with empathy. I'm very fortunate to live in a community where we are really well connected, really close knit. My colleagues on council are a fantastic team. We're really good at disagreeing with one. We have really good relationships. So I think everybody embraces that, and everybody embraces the different approach and the emotional connection we have to the work that we do. So I don't think that's necessarily looked at in a poor light. Obviously, my experience, whether it's dealing with negativity from the public or in this particular issue, being a male versus a female on council, our experiences are going to look a lot different. I have this conversation frequently with my colleague who's in Moncton, right across the river. Shout out to Mayor Don Arnold, who is an incredible role model and community leader in the Greater Moncton region. And so, her experience is very vastly from what I do, and she takes a great deal more abuse than I would. I think one thing I would maybe close the conversation, so I stop rambling and let other people talk. We do talk about having a thicker skin all the time, and I think sometimes, while that's true, we need to be open to criticism from the public. It's also really easy to use an expression like that as a crutch to justify hateful and hurtful behavior, because we are elected officials. But that doesn't mean that we need to take abuse. And I think the rhetoric and the discourse is changing at a federal level, at a provincial level, and it does bleed into the municipal level as well, the way we engage with elected officials. And so having a thicker skin is one thing, tolerating abuse is something that's completely different. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just close with that.
Yeah, I 100% support that. Thank you for that perspective. Sarah, I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on that matter.
In terms of just reacting to other people's comments, you mean, or crying?
Yeah, crying on council and the reaction that you've received. So you talked about, the community not really understanding the mental health impact of elected officials. I'm curious as to whether your colleagues understand the impact, because sometimes it's as though people walk into an office and they put on this guard, right? So, you know, we have to be strong, we can't be vulnerable. I'm curious as to how what that's been like for you with colleagues.
For sure. So I'll give you an example of something that happened around the council table that was very unexpected for me. A number of months back, well, there's been this push through the Women of Ontario Say No to embed legislative change that would ensure that municipally elected officials would be held accountable for workplace violence and harassment. And so I had put forward a motion in support of this, that our mayor would, you know, send a letter of support to make this legislative change in Ontario. And it's not that I thought this would pass with flying colors, but the comments that I heard around the table were really quite shocking. And one of them was like, well, if it's so bad, then why not just call the cops? And I think, you know, what we fail to realize sometimes is that there are protections in nearly every workplace against violence and harassment, and we shouldn't be exempted from that as elected officials. If anything, we should be held to higher standards in that regard. And so should somebody be allowed to hold elected office if they're found, I don't want to say guilty, but if they're found guilty of certainly egregious cases of workplace violence and harassment? And so that one absolutely hit me so hard. And like I said, I did not expect that comment. I certainly expected comments around, well, this is not our role as a municipal government to interfere with the provincial government. Sure. However, we do need to advocate, and even our administration from time to time will encourage us to provide these letters, you know, demanding legislative change. So I do think that that is part of our role. It's obviously not something that we have oversight over, but I do think it's something that we have the ability to influence. So that was one of the times I cried, and I actually ended up, after that vote passed, thankfully, it passed without problem, despite the really quite negative discussion that ensued. I ended up leaving because it was just, it had triggered me so much as somebody who's lived through domestic violence. I felt like, wow, to be so out of touch, to think that it's just a matter of calling the cops and then all of a sudden the violence and harassment just magically goes away. And I know that other council colleagues from, you know, not just across the province, across the country, have dealt with that, you know, from constituents and from colleagues. And there's very little recourse often to take when you're in that position. So I'm very fortunate not to be in that position. And I felt like, you know, given the fact this wasn't necessarily a contentious issue around our council, we hadn't dealt with this, that it wouldn't be like pointing fingers at an individual, but just very broadly around setting expectations. And that certainly was not the case.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That was really impactful. Thank you. Thank you. Marion, in terms of vulnerability, we've heard Andrew and Sarah talk about some examples of being vulnerable, and leaders are often talk about leading by example. How transparent are you about your own challenges with mental health or stress? And do you think that being vulnerable as a leader strengthens or weakens your position?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think back on it, you know, there were lots of times where I wasn't particularly vulnerable. I think sometimes when you're going through a difficult time, it's easier to talk about that when it's over than when it's happening. And maybe you don't even realize sort of the extent to which things are difficult until you're on the other side of it. And I feel like I mentioned this to a few people last week when we were planning for this discussion, but when I think back about the period on council that was the most difficult for me, it was around when my son was born, because we really at that point did not have any structural supports for a leave. So I couldn't take a leave really. And I also didn't really have at that point the kinds of relationships and the trust with my colleagues where I could ask for as much help as I thought I would need. Whereas, you know, I think the other factor was I needed a lot more help than I thought I was going to need. So, you know, I think I was more open and vulnerable about that once it was well in the rearview mirror and it was easier for me to sort of process. But I think the difficulty as elected officials is that, you know, and my experience mirrors Sarah's. When you get off the internet and go into the community, generally, I mean, people do talk about it being a thankless job, but there are actually a lot of people who are very respectful and grateful and even actively supportive of the work that we're doing. The difficulty, I think, is that sometimes, you know, when you're vulnerable about what you might be going through, people are not always respectful of you letting them in. And so I think it's important for people to get the support that they need as elected officials, but it also, you know, there's, I think managing the degree to which you make yourself accessible completely to the public is something that every individual will need to consider carefully. And I think for the three of us on this call, I think I'm probably correct in saying that we don't have a lot of administrative support. We don't have constituency assistants and we don't have political staff that are managing our social media accounts. We're doing it ourselves, right? So you have to, I think, protect your peace to some extent too, and not create additional emotional work for yourself. So I think that's the difficulty that I have had, is trying to find that sweet spot between, you know, letting people know what you're going through and the way in which that might impact your work or your availability, but then also, you know, not adding to your burdens.
Thank you. Andrew spoke earlier, and I think I talked about the practical tips that he has for downtime and protecting his mental health. Curious to hear from you, Marion, and then from Sarah. What does downtime look like for you, and what is your most valuable mental health and well-being superpower?
I think you know, when I think about how enjoyable the work of being on council has been for me, the game changer is something which is unfortunately just luck, which is having, well, not just luck, but it's a large part of it is luck, which is just having colleagues that I trust and that are supportive. And even when we disagree, that those relationships are respectful. And you know, I guess one thing I would say is like those things, I think it's not always available. You can't control what other people do. But I think over time, what I've observed with the last 2 terms on council is just establishing group norms about, you know, nothing formal, but just the way we're going to treat each other, the way we're going to behave in chambers. And that has been incredibly influential in how sustainable my work on council has felt. So my superpower really isn't not much to do with me. It's to do with the people around me. But I think there's also like, you know, to some degree, we can control that and do our best to have respectful relationships with the people that I work with. And then having the ability, I got through my time on council, I got a lot better at setting boundaries about, you know, not checking email after a certain hour at night and not logging into my social media accounts in the evenings and trying to limit the number of evenings out of the house per week. And so, you know, I think you just kind of figure it out as you go in terms of what you can handle and what your family can handle.
Thank you. And what does downtime look like for you?
I really like playing music and sports. And so that's sort of a way to use my brain in a completely different way. And also communities in which nobody really cares about my job. So it's really important to sort of get into those spaces too, where you can just, you know, connect with a different part of your identity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And Sarah, I'll repeat the question. What does downtime look like for you? And what is your most valuable mental health and well-being superpower?
Okay, so definitely for me, and I'm very sad because it's coming to an end shortly, but in terms of my downtime, my like sanctuary and reprieve has largely been my garden. I have gotten rid of most of the grass in my front yard year by year. I just keep extending it and It is like one of those places where it brings me so much joy. I have this like absolutely chaotic flower garden with like random vegetables growing in it, and we're right on the main drag in our city here. And so people walk by all the time, and sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm a little ashamed because it looks very messy, but they're like, we love your garden, it's so nice. And I'm like, thank you. But you know, I also know that again, that's very evidence-based, that just having your hands in soil and being outside and getting that sunshine is good for your mental health. And so oftentimes, you know, I work from home most of the time. And so I'll take my lunch break and, you know, I'll scarf something down really quick, and then I'll go and I'll play in my garden, and not with any real purpose necessarily, just kind of going around and having that time to like decompress my mind. And you know, at the same time, it's like while I'm decompressing, it's sort of like how you have those shower thoughts. It's like when you're not actively thinking about something, I think that's sometimes when you have these like the best aha moments. So that for me has been really fantastic. And I think, you know, I echo what Maren was saying around the relationships and the support that you get from your colleagues, and also from our families. Like I think the three of us here, it sounds like we have really strong family support networks. And I know, you know, for us, our council meetings are in the evenings. You know, so many of the events are in the evening. So my husband is like absolutely amazing, and he picks up all the slack where I leave it, and my parents and my siblings and, you know, people, you had to ask, right? And I think that was, and I don't want to make any presumptions, but like we all kind of mentioned talking to our families before this, because it is not just an individual task that you take on. You need to displace somewhat those responsibilities that you have in your other life, and they need to be taken on by other people. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I think for me, and as Maren suggested earlier around, you know, finding that balance, my first year, I think I said yes to like every single event. And our entire council is at large. So, I mean, it is like every single city event. There's not a ward, it's the whole city of Cornwall. And I love doing that. And prior to being elected, I would be at all those things, but you can't just be anonymous in these places anymore once that happens. So I have been working on the art of just saying no. And I think that it actually has helped my mental health so much to not have something booked every single weekend and every night. So, you know, there's ebbs and flows, and sometimes you do end up with like weeks at a time where you're like, oh my God, I've worked every day and every evening and I'm just ready to crash. But carving out that time where you know there's nothing on the books and you can just relax, I think is so, so important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. We do have a question from the audience, but Andrew, you did give us some tips. Did you want to add anything to what downtime might look like for you?
I also drink wine. That helps sometimes. So no, I'm same as before. Family time, yoga. That's my jam.
I've been waiting for someone to say wine, so I'm glad. Okay, we'll go to audience questions. Thank you all three of you so much for indulging me in my questions. We have a question from Aline. What policies, information pieces can be implemented to help councillors succeed in understanding the role other than a code of conduct policy? I think, Maren, you talked about some of the things that you had put together, so I don't know if you want to reinforce that or if somebody else wants to take it.
Yeah, well, I'll touch on it briefly. I think we are really, over the years, we've really evolved our understanding of what an orientation to council could look like. And previously, I think it was very legislative, and now, and actually I'm seeing a secondary comment in the chat, which I think is related to this. And something that we got in the habit of doing in 2016 was like as soon as the new council was elected, that everyone would go for lunch, get to know each other, and then continue to have sort of scheduled social time, which everyone is invited to a few times a year so that people can get to know one another's families. and also talk a little bit about what they heard on the doorstep and what they want to achieve. And obviously that doesn't always overlap, but just to understand where everyone is coming from. And our administration does not participate in those social times. That's just council, and the mayor often organizes that. But we've also really embraced a more robust orientation process. So the new council's getting oriented today, actually, and they're getting sworn in tomorrow. And so that now involves like going through a mock council meeting and doing a bunch of practice question and answer, behind closed doors, so people can get a sense of how these processes work, and hopefully a less intimidating environment. So those are some of the things that are happening in Saskatoon, but it evolves every time because we keep finding things that we wish we would have added. So I think it's a dynamic process.
Thank you, Marion. Anyone else want to chime in?
I think investing in professional development for your council is really important too. The onboarding process is really important, but we're also looking at doing governance training with our council. We've done it when everybody first started, but we want to do refreshers. A lot of people on the call might have heard of George Cuff, and so he did our governance training the first time. We're looking at working with a different consultant to do that, but also just issues that are important. We're going to do some DEI training with council, and different opportunities to do professional development helps build that team as well. We just, Marin, similar to maybe some of your experience, we just went through a by-election in Riverview. And so we'll be getting our council team together just for supper to talk about the role itself. The last time we did this, I had every member of council just sort of give what's your one best piece of advice for the new councillor, and how can we support each other, and trying to foster that relationship so we get really good at disagreeing with one another and really effective at doing the role in council chambers. And the heated conversations can stay in chambers, and then we can go back to being colleagues and respected residents after the work is done. So
thank you, Andrew. We're 4 minutes away, and we do have one more question, but I'm hoping that with a summary of the things that we heard today, that will answer that question. And the question from Sarah is, how do you manage abuse from the community? Do you have any effective techniques to deal with it? So I'll go through the summary, and then if anybody else wants to chime in, please feel free to do so. So I think some of the ones that stood out to me was Sarah talked about getting ahead of the communication when you have something to communicate. We talked about prioritizing self-care and being able to have values-based decision making when it's coming from online. We talked about limiting the number of time that you're spending online, the amount of time you're spent on checking emails, and limiting the amount of times that you're actually out doing social events, and finding those things that really help you to balance balance your mental health and your well-being, like gardening and exercise, eating, sleeping well at night, and getting the support from the community around you, community being your family and friends that support you. So don't know if anybody else wants to add anything more to that, or if we can turn it back over to Evan.
Just had one brief comment, Harriet, if I could, in response to Sarah's comment or question rather. And one thing that I think all of my colleagues and I have sort of implemented is an understanding that when people are angry, there's no urgency to engage with them when they are in that red zone. And I even started when if I was talking to people on the phone or in person and they were really elevated, I would say, I'm really happy to resume this conversation with you another time, and I'll call you tomorrow or whatever. So I think like giving time to individual constituents who are approaching you in a really elevated state is an important boundary to try to hold. And, that's another thing that I found really effective was asking people what they wanted to get out of the conversation. Are you wanting to talk about solutions, or are you wanting to share with me that you're angry? Because if people just want to share with you that they're angry, then I stopped feeling an obligation to fix it. And that it didn't make those conversations more pleasant, but it did reduce the amount of obligation I felt to sort of resolve it. So I hope that some of that might be helpful to you.
Thank you, Marion. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today. And to Sarah, Andrew, and Marion, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being so open and vulnerable, because I truly believe that by doing so, that's the only way that people can truly learn from you and your experience. So thank you. And now back to you, Evan.
Harriet, I'll just repeat that. So thank you, Councillors Lowen and Good and Mayor LeBlanc, and thank you to GreenShield Canada for your collaboration and insights in support of today's session. The recording of today's conversation will be posted on fcm.ca in the coming days, so please feel free to share this as a resource with your colleagues, with new council members. I think it could have some value. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please join us in December. Date still to be determined for our next collective conversation, another unfortunately relevant talk about creating fire smart communities presented in partnership with Intact. For now, be well, everyone. Bye.